To be able to determine if our friends are online or if we want to chat to one of our friends or make a call to one of our friends, we first need to actually set up the functionality to get or add our friends. So in this video, we extend the user entity to include a one-to-many relation with the friend request entity. And we'll be able to create the endpoints such that we can add friends or get our friends, so we can determine if the friends are online, or we can message a friend that's online or not, or make a call with a friend that's online or not. And we handle those in different ways. So it's important to be able to tell which friends are online and which aren't. So to be able to do that, or to help to be able to do that, we also create a user interceptor. So on all of our requests that need the user data, basically from the front end, you send a request to the back end. It's going to have the JSON web token attached in the header. We need to be able to get that. We need to decode it. We need to be able to get the user object. And that way, on all of our API requests that use the interceptor for the user interceptor, we can retrieve that user information, and then we can make API requests such as getting our friends based on the user ID. So we don't want to pass that ID in because we want to be doing that on many endpoints. So we create that interceptor to be able to do so. Let's start off by extending our user entity to have a one-to-many relationship with a friend request entity, which we will build up. So in our user entity, let's start off by having this one-to-many annotation, which is type alms method here, or annotation that we can write, such that our column is going to have a relationship with our other column, which we're going to create in a new table, the friend request entity table. Now, these sort of work together. So in our user entity, we need to reference the friend request entity, which we will create. And then based on the friend request entity, the column that we're having a relationship to, or a foreign key to, is going to be on the creator field on the friend request entity. That way there's a way to map the user entity to the friend request entity, a unique way to identify which person is the creator, for example. And then because it's a one-to-many, any one user can have multiple friends. So we have a one-to-many relationship which returns an array of friend requests entities. Now we're using friend requests, and if you go to the friend request entity, the first thing to note is that I'm just doing this in the entities folder in the shared library. Now there's two reasons why. The first is this is the Facebook Messenger clone, and the focus of this is on the chat functionality, the video functionality, online presence, and those sorts of things in the microservices architecture. I've actually got a 30-hour LinkedIn clone series which goes into much more detail about friend request management and stuff like that. So you might want to check that out if you want a really thorough understanding of friend request managements. But we just need a way to be able to have users, have friends, such that we can display the online users and talk to them and all of that sort of stuff. So we will still focus on creating friends and getting them, but there's a bit of an assumption that that they will already be set up, because if you have the Facebook app, you add it on the Facebook app rather than the Facebook Messenger app. And that's the first reason. The second reason is because of this one-to-many stuff and the user entity being in here, we don't really want to have any difficulties with imports or anything like that. So technically you wouldn't really want the friend request stuff in here, but the main reason is I want to lean out the source in the apps folder. You know, there's no real good place to put that. You could put in the API gateway, auth, or presence. But I want to lean those out and have those folders be modularized. So, of course, you can refactor this to any way you want. Again, the focus of this is on the Facebook Messenger stuff. We just need something to be able to set this all up. So the inverse of the one-to-many is the many-to-one. So all of the friend requests will belong to a friend. And then we have this sort of coupled labeling here. So we can see that we've got this entity, the friend request entity, which we call the friend request entity, which makes it clear to see that, you know, for our user, we're mapping it to the friend request entity, and based on the friend request entity object, which is just an object with all the fields, the field that we're going to map the user to is going to be based on the creator. So we need a creator, and a creator is going to be a user. So the user entity will map to the friend request creator, which is what we've called it here. And then that's going to be an array of friend requests. And then of course the creator is the user entity itself. So we'll also need a one-to-many relationship for the receiver. So basically I just needed an easy way to be able to have an API call to make the friend. So I have a bunch of friends that doesn't violate any of the foreign key restraints. So a user can add someone, or another user can add them. Again, I go into much more detail in the LinkedIn clone series. But basically we want to be aware, it doesn't really matter if we are the creator or the receiver, but they both reference entities here and user entities. And when we get our friends, it doesn't really matter which one's which. We'll just get our friend request based on either of those fields. So we can come back here, and then we can just do the inverse over on this end here as well. So we have the many-to-one relationship to the user entity, and the user entity has the friend request receiver, which is what we've called this here. And in here, we've just called it the receiver, which again, it points to the user entity here. So we can come to our friend request repository here, and we can see that this is just more or less the same as the users repository. Again, would you want it in the shared folder? Probably not, but for purposes of this project and convenience, we've just put it in here. So of course, we've got this friend request repository. It just extends the base abstract repository, and then we can just chuck in this friend request entity here, which is going to implement the friend request interface here. So the friend request interface, this looks like an error. It's just a linked thing. Basically the friend request repository interface, it just extends the base interface. So make sure you've checked out the repository design pattern in NestJS, that video series. But essentially we've just decoupled the logic between the ORM and the the data layers and the business logic. So we can just, for our entity or the interface representing our entity in our repository, we've just decoupled that by simply extending all of the type ORM methods here. So we can just say, we want to implement that interface. So then when we use that friend request repository anyway, we can access all of the methods like save and find one and all that sort of stuff. So we just inject that entity here. And then we can just make a reference to the friend request entity here. So all is well and good so far. Again, this is an error. This is just linting. We can actually just close these first 4 up. And if we come to our app controller, remember our API gateway, this is where the endpoints are. So I've got this note here saying this would be done already from the main Facebook app, but we just want a simple endpoint so we can just add friends and also get the friends. So I've got this post request to add the friend based on the friend ID. So we can just go ahead and add the friend here. And one thing to note is we're going to use the Auth module, the Auth service, to be able to do all this sort of stuff. So in the Auth module, what we're going to do here is we're just going to provide that friend request repository that we just created by using that class, and also provide that interface there. But back to the actual API endpoint, if we want to add a friend, we can, and we also want to have the use guards, because you can't add someone unless you're logged in. Now, we also have this thing here, use interceptors, and we'll come back to this. But basically what this does is when someone sends an API request from the front end, there's a JSON Web Token attached to the headers. We want to intercept those headers, get the JSON Web Token, and then get the user object from that JSON Web Token by decoding it. So that's what those interceptors are going to do. And then basically, we want to have a user request. So the user request, this is just going to extend the regular Express request. So you make an API call from the front end, it hits our Express backend, and then we just want to extend that because we just want to add the user object to that. And we're going to do that by intercepting. So the JSON Web Token might not be on there, which means when we intercept it, the user object might not be on there. So that's why I've got this Elvis operator here. But if you do have the user object, we'll have all of these fields, the ID, the first name, last name, and email. And then we'll be able to use those. So I've also got this user JSON Web Token interface here. This is just the same as the user request here, but the when you decode a JSON Web Token, you get the payload, which is the user object, but we also have an IAT and an expiration date, so initialization date and expiration date. So we can just close that up there. We can return back to our app controller, and then we know that after our interception has occurred, our request will have this user request on there. So as a param, we got this dynamic value here. So the friend we're adding is going to be the friend ID. Now again, this is just going to add them directly just because I needed a simple way. But if you want some friend management, they have to wait for your response, go to their profile, accept it, all that stuff. That's in the LinkedIn clone series, so check that out. You don't have to follow along with the whole series. You can just watch the particular video. But again, I've already covered that material, so let's just set this up like this. So basically what we want to do here is if there's no user on the request, we'll just throw a bad request exception. They shouldn't be able to actually get into here because we've got this auth guard. So if they make it through the auth guard, they should have a JSON Web Token attached. Just some extra safety here. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to return this auth service here. And we're going to use our microservices to forward the message from the API gateway to the auth service. And we're going to use the command add friend for that. And then we're going to attach the user ID, which we're going to get off the request. And then we're going to have the friend ID, which we're getting from the dynamic part there. So that's the post request. And then we're going to do a similar thing for the get request. So this should be quite trivial. So I'll do them both at the same time. So we add the guards and the intercepts for the get request, get friends. Again, we have the user request. If it's not there, we throw a bad exception. Otherwise, we can just send the command or forward the request to the auth service, and we can get the friends here, and then we just attach the user ID. So pretty basic stuff. And then we can go to our auth controller here. And what we want to do is, well, we want an ability to decode the JSON Web Token. So, and we're going to call this from our interceptor. But before we set up the interceptor, we need a way to decode the JSON Web Token, which the interceptor is going to give back to us so we can get the user object and attach it. So to be able to do that, I've just got this message pattern annotation here with the command decode JSON Web Token. So we got some context here from RabbitMQ, and then we also got the payload. So what we're expecting is the JSON Web Token, and based on that, we want to decode it. So we just acknowledge that we've received the message based on the context there to DQ it. And then the auth service, we're going to have this method called getUserFromHeader. And we're going to attach the JSON, the payload from which has the JSON Web Token. So we'll get into that, but I just wanted to return back to what we just set up from our API gateway, where we had the command add friend. Again, this takes the context and the payload, where we had the user ID and the friend ID. And then what we want to do is we just want to add the friend based on that. And then similarly for the get friends request, this is where the request will be forwarded to this auth microservice. We have the context, the payload, the acknowledgement of the message, and then we're going to have this get friends message here, method here, which will take the user ID. So we'll return back to the decode JSON Web Token. Just want to have a look at the auth service for these methods here. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're just going to need a helper. We could make this private if we wanted to, but we have this find by ID, very simple. We just get the ID and then we can get the user based on that ID. And we just need that so we can get the user that we want to add to the friend, because it's a reference to the user entity itself. So basically, okay, so here we've got this get user from header method here. And basically what this is going to do is we just want to essentially decode the JSON Web Token. So we're getting the JSON Web Token from the header. And then we just simply call this JSON Web Token decode. By this point, we know it's going to be the user JWT, so we can pass that to that type we created. Otherwise, we just throw a bad request exception. So we'll come back to how this and this actually work with the interceptor. There's just one missing step there. But before we do that, let's just look at the basic CRUD operations. So adding a friend, basically what we want to do is we've got the user ID and the friend ID, and we've created that find by ID method. So we can actually find the creator and the receiver by finding by the ID based on the user ID or the friend ID. And then what we can do is we can just add the friend by using the friend request repository and then saving based on the creator and the receiver. So recall that a friend request table, all it has is the ID, the creator and the receiver. So we actually reference the user entity itself, and that's why we find these here. And the get friends method, it's a similar sort of thing, but we only need to find the creator. So we await that by finding the ID of the user ID that gets passed into it, and then using the friend request repository. One extra step here is we want to use the find with relations, because when we get the friends, we're not just getting the receiving friends. If we created the friend, we want to get that as well. So we just have this object here, which is essentially the options that you can pass in. So I have this where clause, where the creator is equal to the creator and the receiver is also equal to the creator. So essentially what this does is it finds both if you created it or if you received the friend request. And then we have some relations here because the creator and the receiver columns from the friend request relate to the user entity. We just specify that we have some relations there. So that's pretty much the posting and getting the friends. One thing to note is you will need to just come back to this auth service interface and just add in those extra methods there. And I did make one small tweak to one of the methods. It's the one that was giving back a JSON Web Token. This one here. So this verify JSON Web Token. If we just quickly open this up here, and then we look for where it's used in here. Basically, all I've done is I've just returned the user as well. So you can do that just by object destructuring to get the user, because we actually needed the user returned after we verify it to sort of attach that user to the request. So let's just see that. So yeah, so we've got the auth controller, auth service. We've amended the auth service interface, and we've also just added in all these imports here. So we've got these interceptors, the friend request repository, the friend request interface, and then those two user interfaces that we created there. So the final piece of the puzzle here is just going to the actual, where is it? I've called it the interceptor. So I've got this user interceptor here. So let's just open that up. Yeah, so in the shared folder, I've created this interceptors folder here. So this is the last bit of work here. So basically what we want to do, so as we've seen here, if we want to, actually it's in the app controller. The app controller, so you make the HTTP request to the API gateway, and let's say we want to add a friend. Well, we need to get our user's details from the user interceptor. We come to the user interceptor. Now we know that it's a HTTP request because that's the way we've set things up. If we needed to have that information on a microservice that talks to another one, we can just simply pass that in. So that's the benefit of microservices. You could also look for it. Like, for example, what I mean is the user interceptor here, it implements the Nest Interceptor, which has this intercept method on it. So we're just injecting our auth service. So we've seen this before, but we have the context, the execution context, and this is how we can tell what the type is. So if we have this method here, context.getType, and basically what I've done here, I said if it's not HTTP, return to the next, well, this is sort of like middleware in, so it just does nothing and skips the whole rest of the request. And that means nothing will be attached. Now we're setting this up ourselves, so we know that we're going to have our interceptions on the API calls. And if we did need it at a later stage, we can just come back here and check for the get type to see if it is RPC, a remote procedure call, which is what microservices are, like in RabbitMQ or any other transport layers you may use. And you can also have WebSockets as well, so we may need to use that. So we'll come back to those if we need to. But again, you can just sort of pass the information on in the payload, so it's not really a big deal. So we'll sort of, come to that as we need it, rather than over engineering too early and then realizing we want to do it a different way. So yeah, basically the intercept method, it gives you this context, and then also it gives you this next call handler. And then we're returning an observable of the any type. It is the any type, and that's okay because it can be anything. Any request can get intercepted, which will have any interface. So basically, we know that it's going to be a HTTP request, or at least initially from a HTTP request. So we can use this context switch to HTTP get request. And then we can get the auth header. Now we know that we've set it up on the front end, so we have a bearer token. So in the headers, in the authorization header, we can actually just get the auth header. Now we've got this safety check here. If there is no auth header, well, just don't attach anything to the request, which means the user won't be attached to the request, which means they won't have the permissions or authorization to do some of the things that require authorization. And then we just go ahead and we just split it up. So we know that we get the bearer bearer space, then the JSON Web Token. So this is similar sort of logic to how we've set it up. Potentially we could have refactored this into a helper function or something like that. But I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer. Again, we just get the JSON Web Token. And then what we can do here is we can just use an observable. And we use an observable. So this is where it all comes together, basically. So basically, you make the HTTP request. You want to add a friend. Now, you need to get the actual user, because we use the user to make the as one of the properties in the to be able to access the data. And then we can say, okay, well, what we can do is in our interceptor, we can call our auth service. And the auth service, what we can do is we can decode our JSON Web Token. And that's actually in the auth controller where we have the command which references the service. So we have this decode JSON Web Token here. And then we've seen that we're getting the user from the header. So this JSON Web Token, it is coming from the header because, we're extracting it from the header here. And then I pass that JSON Web Token as a parameter to the auth controller here, which handles getting the user. And essentially all that does is just use the JWT package to decode the JSON Web Token. So what we can do is, since that returns an observable, we can just pipe into that, and then we can use the switch map operator to return another observable based on the data. So we can just use some object destructuring to get the user. And then for that request that we created here, what we can do is we can simply attach the user or add the user property to extend the type from a, what's it called? A express request to a actual JWT or user request, I think I called it, by attaching this user here. And then if that's all well and good, or even if it isn't, I'll just go next handle, and that will either attach it or won't attach it. I think there's another operator, so you could have done this in one go, like after all or something like that. I just didn't spend the time to look that up. But yeah, so you can just do that. And then if you needed this for microservices like RPC, I mean, I think you can sort of structure in a way where you don't need to do that. But let's say you have something really complicated, or you find out that you do need to do that. It's actually quite simple, because you can just basically do a similar sort of thing. And then you can just say, well, if it is the RPC, you know, you just get the data in a different way. And then essentially you can just follow all the same steps and attach it like that. And then when you consume it, you all just need to consume it slightly differently. But yeah, you can just do it like that. So yeah, so if we come back to where we were, so we can say, okay, well, we have the request, the user request, because we've added these interceptors in. We've got this guard on there. So we know that there will be a JSON Web Token, and then the user will be attached. And then we get the friend ID from the post request, and then we just simply add the friend, and then, you know, we end up using type ORM, and then it'll just, you know, do the work for us. Similar sort of thing with the get friends. We have an auth guard on it. We have an interceptor here for the get friends request. We have the user, and then we can actually get the friends based on that user. So let's actually just see all of that, make sure it's all working well and good. So I'm just going to open the command line here, and I'm going to run a docker compose up. Oh, and by the way, I think I've deleted, well, before I ran that, I deleted the data folder there. That's because I didn't have some of the relations, and it was just an easy way to do it. You can also delete the dist folder, that just gets built. So if I go to Postman, basically if I get my users, well, I get no users at all. So what I want to do is I want to register. So I'm going to create 3 accounts here. So there's John with ID 1, John 2 with ID 2, and John 3 with the ID 3. So basically I want to log in. So I'm just going to log in as John 1 here. I'm just going to copy this JSON Web Token here. And then I'm going to, well, firstly, I'm going to try to add, I'm logged in as user 1, and then I'll try and add user 2. So firstly, let's try and just do that without a JSON Web Token. I'll just delete this one that I had in there before. You get this 403, so that's good. And then let's go ahead and just add this token in here. And then we get this back here. And then let's add user 3 as well. And then you also get this back here. So then if I try to get my friends with the new JSON Web Token, did I not type that in right? Let's see here. Let's copy this in here. Okay. So basically I'm logged in as user 1, and you can see that, well, I was the creator for both this one with friend 2 and also with friend 3 here. But what I can do is I can actually log into user 2 to confirm this. So I'll copy this JSON Web Token here. And if I go to here, I type in the new JSON Web Token, you see that I've just got one friend here, and the user with ID 1 was the creator, and then I was the receiver here, but you still get that back. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover here. Thanks so much for watching, guys. And we've done all of the prelude and everything that we needed to set up so we can start working on online presence with hybrid microservices. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, and I'll be getting that video out there soon. Thanks so much, guys. Cheers.